Hey everyone, welcome back to here in Apologetics. I'm so pumped you're joining us today. Today I have the Emerson Green joining the podcast. We're talking about like theism, atheism, agnosticism, all kinds of fun things. As always, this podcast is brought to you guys at patreon.com/here in Apologetics. But Emerson, thank you so much for joining me today. How you been?
I've been good. Thank you for having me back.
It's good to talk to you, and I always love talking to you. And we've done all sorts of stuff together in the past. And today it's interesting because like I feel like I've followed your journey, as it continues, not from the beginning really of your channel and everything. But for people who may not know who you are, Emerson, talk a little bit about like who you are, what you do, things like that.
Well, I started like a blog and a podcast a few years back, and mainly because I wanted to talk about apologetics. I had like a huge appetite for it, and I was kind of bothering people in my real life, so I had to like go to the internet to talk about it with other people who were interested. And I sort of started in one position. You know, I was definitely an atheist, more like like a pretty strong atheist. I thought there was like a 1 in a billion chance that God existed. And I've slowly been moving towards the agnostic, kind of middle of the road position that I'm, sort of at now. I guess I'm like an agnostic with atheist leanings. Um, but yeah, I mean, that's sort of been the transition that we're talking about today, I think.
So like broadly speaking, Emerson, like would you say that like today, like as we're talking in June of 2024, like you are agnostic?
Yeah, agnostic, like with atheist leanings. Like I'm not exactly in the middle. I think of this sort of as like I used to have a very low credence in theism. I thought it was probably false. And then now like my credence is high enough in theism, it just doesn't feel right to say that I'm an atheist at this point. Like something has changed. And it's just like it's I mean, not to bring up this stupid debate, but like it's one reason I don't like the lacktheist definition of atheism, where it's like, okay, I went from lacking a belief in God to lacking a belief in God. So like nothing's changed, but obviously something has changed. So um, like my credence in theism has gone up, and we can get into the reasons for that. But like, yeah, I have like a different feeling about like the plausibility of the idea that God exists, like broadly construed.
Do you wanna, and I think this would be helpful for people, Emerson, share a little bit about, like, your story and kinda, like, what brings you to where you are today? Because you started off like a Christian, and you said you kinda go through this not phase, but, like, you were at this point, like, this very strong atheist of, like, "Oh, it's, like, 1 in a million," or something like that,
Mhm.
and now you're kinda, like, in this, like, agnostic kinda realm leaning towards atheism. What what's the story there? Like, if you're gonna spend a few minutes, just share the story.
Yeah, no, it's actually important to how I think about things now. Um, because when I started off, I was like a Protestant, young earth creationist, kind of fundamentalist Christian. Um, And to me, that just was Christianity, like eternal conscious torment and young earth creationism and biblical literalism and inerrantism. And, there's like this package that I thought, okay, that's like real Christianity. And there were some other like kind of fundamentalist assumptions baked into how I saw like religion in general. And then, you know, Kenny Pierce has this great tweet. He has a lot of great tweets. And I enjoy watching him on your channel, by the way. I like those clips you post. But Kenny Pierce was saying, "Oh, this is a great way to make deconverts if you tell people, here's the true list of like Christian doctrines, and like this is it. Like you have to accept all these, or else you might as well just, be an atheist." And like I think the phrase he used was like give up on Jesus. Um, so he's like, okay, the thing is, you're probably wrong about something on that list. So like, if people really adopt that assumption that like, okay, this is it. Like this is the only real form of Christianity. And now I don't agree with like one or two of the things on this list. Well, if they share kind of your fundamentalist assumptions, then they're going to end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And it's all predicated on this idea that Christianity is not a diverse tradition. Okay, but it obviously is. Um, but I didn't view it that way. So I came to think that there were a few specific things that were wrong, that I was like the form of Christianity that I was raised with. um, I came to think that some of that was wrong. Okay, so then I ended up like slingshotting to atheism, and I eventually, developed some like decent reasons for being an atheist. I think there's evidence against theism, uh, but I think that I was kind of fundamentally mistaken about how I was approaching it, where I was treating theism like it wasn't a diverse tradition, and even Christianity like it wasn't a diverse tradition. So I thought that you could rule out theism and rule out Christianity by ruling out really specific forms of theism and really specific forms of Christianity. And the more I've appreciated like all the ways in which it could be true that God exists, and like, you know, similarly all the ways in which it could be true that God doesn't exist, it makes me feel almost like I don't know, like overwhelmed, where it feels kind of hard to really latch on to one of those two possibilities in good faith and be like, oh no, it's definitely the case that none of the possible worlds where God exists, like no, that's not our world for sure. It's like, I don't know, there are just so many ways for theism to be true. um and I was erroneously treating the possibilities as much narrower than they actually were. So, you know, I think it shouldn't be that hard to recognize that, like, just because you can give very good reasons to rule out young earth creationism or something like that, or very good reasons to rule out, say, like the strong view of eternal conscious torment or something, it's obvious that that does not mean that God doesn't exist, right? Like there could be a God and then eternal conscious torment is false, or like there could be a God and the universe is very old. That seems obvious, right? But what I'm saying is like that same insight carries over to just so many like to so many things where we're kind of, it's hard to just talk about God and just talk about theism without all these like theologically laden conceptions of theism that are constantly just sneaking in and like seemingly impossible to get away from. And for the fleeting moments when I feel like I have gotten away from that, it just feels almost disingenuous to say, "Oh yeah, I'm pretty confident that God doesn't exist." Yeah, I'm pretty confident that like certain forms of Christian theism are false. Okay, like I'm extremely confident that like many popular forms of religious belief like do not like correspond with reality or whatever. Um, but you know, just some non-specific God or some divine reality, like I just really can't say with a high degree of confidence that that's not that like couldn't be true or something. Um, but yeah, I mean, look, theism is a diverse tradition, Christianity is a diverse tradition, and the flip side of this has to do with atheism. Something like a pet peeve I have with apologists is when they try to put beliefs on atheists that are not really essential to atheism. Like when they try to act like, oh well, you know, atheists, they're like nihilists and materialists and determinists who reject free will and, you know, so on and so forth. And it's like, yeah, a lot of atheists believe those things, but a lot of Christians believe in you know, young earth creationism. I mean, just ruling out one specific doctrine that, you know, is commonly held by members of that group, it just does not rule out theism. And likewise, if you have an argument against determinism or against physicalism or whatever, you have not even come close to arguing against atheism. Okay, so like that was really easy for me to see on my end because, you know, I'm not a physicalist, and like even as an atheist, I had views that were like fringe for most atheists, you know. So like I was well aware that like, yeah, most of the arguments against atheism that people offer have nothing to do with atheism. Okay. And like what I'm saying is that exact thing is also happening with theism. Like, you know, whenever we're talking about, oh, does God exist? You know, theism versus naturalism. A lot of the time we're talking about a very theologically laden conception of God. And, you know, not much has changed in that specific regard of like, oh, do you think that you know, version of theism that was common when I like grew up, you know, do you think that might be true? Are you agnostic about that? It's like, no, not at all. Like, I don't think there's like any chance of that being true. But I just think there's like, there are so many possibilities. Like, there are so many possible worlds where God exists or something godlike, some kind of divine reality. Like, if you're liberal enough with your conception of God, which, you know, I am open to like finitist forms of theism and non-standard models of God and all the rest of it. So I know that's a very long answer to your question, but I think it's kind of important to like seeing where I came from and how I got to this point where it's like, well, I bought into these fundamentalist assumptions where it's like, here's what real Christianity is. And if you reject even one of these, you know, you're an atheist basically. And I was like, okay, I'm an atheist. And then I've kind of slowly been migrating more towards this middle-ish position of, you know, agnostic with atheist leanings. But yeah, that's a big part of it, is just recognizing the diversity of the theistic tradition and even the Christian tradition, and being like, look, all I can do, honestly, when some people are spelling out their worldview, I feel like all I can honestly do is like say, yeah, it could be. I don't believe it exactly, but I have a few arguments against theism and against Christianity, but there are certain Christians out there and certain theists out there who've presented like a picture of the world that kind of, avoid some of these concerns that I raise. So then I just have to look at that, admittedly fringe, possibly heretical view they're offering and be like, yeah, could be.
Well, yeah, thank you for sharing your story. I really appreciate that. And I do think it's important to remember that like the differing views within like Christianity, like not everyone has the same theology, and it's the same if you look at it from an atheist perspective. Like not every atheist, like you said, Emerson, is like a materialist, determinist, with moral nihilist and all that stuff. I'm curious before we look at like some of the reasons about where you're at, where you are now. Who are these Christians that you're talking about, or maybe theists that have kind of influenced you, and you're like, okay, well, like this isn't like some form of Christianity that makes zero sense to me.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, first, let me say that's not like what I just outlined is not the only thing. It wasn't the only consideration that pushed me more towards agnosticism. That's one reason. But as for the forms of Christianity that I'm impressed by, I guess I'm thinking of like, we mentioned him a moment ago, like Kenny Pierce has some interesting ideas. Josh Rasmussen, Dustin Crummett, um, my friend Joseph Lawal, who believes in like a finitist form of theism. Um, they're just it's not really like any one grand like narrative that's been presented to me. I'm like, oh, maybe that. It's sort of like a lot of these people have interesting ideas that solve some particular problem that I thought was like kind of hard to avoid. So um for instance, a lot of so like I mentioned Joseph Lawal, who's LDS philosophy on YouTube, and I think Josh Rasmussen, uh, if he doesn't accept this, he sure talks about it a lot in very favorable ways, where they talk about like pre-existence. Um, and Amos Wallen wrote this blog post about how pre-existence can solve some particular aspect of the problem of evil, where it's like, sometimes atheists will say, why didn't we start off in heaven? Like sometimes it's called the problem of heaven. Like, why not just create everybody there? And then, you can leave if you want to or something. And some people are like, that is what happened. That's exactly what happened. We did start off in heaven and then some of us left for some reason. And it's like, okay, that sounds like a fairly outlandish story, but not really more outlandish than what Christians ordinarily believe when it comes down to it. It's just I'm used to one story and not used to the other. Um, but if you're presenting like the problem of heaven, it's totally open to theists and even Christian theists to be like, uh, yeah, you're right about all of that. And it helped me realize that we did in fact start out in heaven, and then we left for some reason. Um, a lot of ideas about why you might leave. But anyway, Amos's point was that like pre-existence can solve at least the deontological problem of evil. And I would highly recommend checking out his Substack to like see the case for that. Amos is like a generic theist. He's not like a Christian theist or anything. He's kind of sympathetic to Hinduism, or at least a couple of general features of it, but he's just like a theist. He doesn't believe any particular religion. But anyway, so it's like, and Josh Rasmussen has talked about this in the context of NDEs, where there are so many NDE reports where people think they're going back to somewhere they've been before. So it's kind of inconsistent to take these NDE reports really seriously, like a lot of Christians do, but then dismiss the specific features of them, where it's like, oh yeah, this proves that there's an afterlife. But the part where there are tons and tons of testimonies about how, yeah, I felt like I was going back to a place that I'd been before, and I had a sense I was there and then came here. For some reason, that doesn't count. But like Josh takes it seriously, I think. Um, this idea that we existed in heaven or something prior and then chose to come here, like agreed to come here. Um, that's just like one random example. Like, okay, like I said, when people talk about theism versus naturalism, a lot of times they're implicitly bringing all this theological baggage, to the table. Where if you bring up pre-existence, they're just like, well, that doesn't count. Like you can't bring that in. It's like, why not? It's perfectly consistent with theism. And just because it's not traditionally believed by Christians, okay, like a theist could still invoke pre-existence, like in trying to answer like the problem of evil or something. Um, So, I just picked that one example, but it's more things like that rather than like a grand narrative. It's more like, okay, here's something that's pretty out of the box given your contingent circumstances, something that most theists don't defend and don't talk about. And doesn't that kind of like put things in a different light a little bit? And I'm like, yeah, I guess it kind of does. So, there are quite a few examples of just things like that, like some idea that I had just not really taken seriously. Universalism was one of these ideas. I talked about this on your show, like a year or so ago, where universalism was just a joke to me. Like, as a Christian, I'm like, that's not consistent with Christianity. Like, you cannot possibly be a real Christian and think that everyone will be ultimately saved from like death and suffering and all that. Christianity is a story where a huge portion of the population is either annihilated or suffers forever. That's the hopeful good news, I guess. And then, you encounter Christians who are just like, no, that's not true. Like, all will ultimately, in the end, in the grand scheme of time, be, saved from death and suffering. Um, and it is consistent with Christianity. So it's just sort of little things like that that chip away at your confidence, because when I was saying, yeah, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God, what I really meant was I don't believe in this narrow subset of gods, and that's still true. I still don't believe in those. I mean, I'm totally confident that certain forms of theism are false. Okay, just like I'm very confident that certain forms of atheism are false, like materialist nihilism or whatever. um, you know, but theism is just it's just so much broader than that. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for like shining light on that idea again. That it's not like, oh, there's this one view of theism that exists where it worked out exactly this way, and there's this also just this one view of atheism and it just worked out exactly this way, and like those are our two options.
Yeah.
That's it. It's not that way. What I'd love to do, Emerson, now is look at some of the reasons that kind of maybe draw out your agnosticism, and we can just kind of like discuss it a little bit and hear your thoughts. The first thing you mentioned to me was like religious ambiguity. So do you want to talk a little bit about like what this is and kind of how this plays into your thought process?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is what I already mentioned about there are just so many ways for theism or atheism to be true. Like, when it comes down to it, there are very few commitments that are pushed on you as an atheist or as a theist, and the fewer commitments that you have, like the greater number of possible worlds, where your general thesis is right. Um, so that's part of it, just recognizing the diversity of the tradition of theism and just how atheism is compatible with, like, you know it's just so much broader than the way apologists typically treat it. Also just peer disagreement. I know that also pushed me a lot towards agnosticism, like recognizing there are all these really intelligent people who are intellectually honest and very well read, know a lot more than I do about this topic, and they disagree with me. And there are also people who fit that description who agree with me. But like, I don't know, just disagreement among experts, people who I consider experts, like in disagreement among peers who I respect, kind of made me lower my confidence. I mean, ultimately I'm going to stick to my guns. Like, if I can't see why I'm wrong, I'm not going to be like, I'm not going to, you know, shy away from that. But um, still, it's I think a pretty natural response to like disagreement among epistemic peers to be like, oh, maybe I should be slightly less confident in my belief because there are all these other people who are intelligent and well informed, just as much as I am, if not more so, and they disagree, um, not just with me but with each other. So peer disagreement, I didn't really know what else. I don't really know how else to handle that, other than just kind of holding on to things a little more loosely. It just seems like that's the most rational response to peer disagreement, of that nature. Um, Also, just another factor, in addition to the two that I've mentioned, is I have no idea how to set my priors. Like, I don't know how to set the prior probability of different hypotheses. Like, I have some very vague idea about how to do that, but like nothing so specific that I'm like totally confident what the prior is of theism, or like what's the intrinsic probability of naturalism. I think Paul Draper has a really compelling theory of, how to set intrinsic probability, but it still feels so silly, like putting really specific numbers on it. You know what I mean? Like, I just can't I can't take it seriously when people say, like, when they assign like too specific, where it's like, oh, it's 23% likelihood that like theism is true or something, or like when Richard Swinburne's like, there's 97% chance that the resurrection occurred. I'm like, I don't know, man. It's just so goofy. Like, I just can't take that kind of thing seriously. You can say like, yeah, it's more probable. You can say it's very, very improbable, or it's like more likely than not. You can make these general statements. I don't think we're just totally adrift, lost at sea. We have no idea how to set the probability of anything. But, just getting too specific about it feels silly. So yeah, I don't really have a clear and distinct idea of how to set priors. Okay, well, the prior probability affects the all things considered probability. It's really important. So uh, the fact that I'm not exactly sure how to set it is humbling, epistemically. And then there's this other factor. It's kind of been like in the background of some of this stuff as we've been talking. Like, my beliefs are like influenced by totally contingent social factors. Like I would believe very differently if I were born 1,000 years ago, or 1,000 years in the future, or in a different part of the world, or with like different genes or different peers. It's just, again, I'm not sure exactly what else to do other than like stick to my guns. But it is still kind of humbling when you realize like how contingent some of your common sense is. Like, the idea that Mormonism sounds really silly to a lot of people, but like Protestantism, like you can list off beliefs that Catholics have and they're just like, of course. And then you list off some Mormon beliefs and those apparently sound silly. And it's like, I think that's like a contingent fact. Like, I don't think that that's like inherent to the theories at all. So just realizing like what makes sense to me and what sounds silly, a lot of that, at least some of it, some non-zero amount of it is like socially contingent, and again, it's just humbling to realize that. So yeah, I mean, pure disagreement, setting priors, recognizing the contingency of my beliefs, recognizing, all the possible worlds in which theism and atheism can be true. And then just being impressed by some of the creative world pictures that have been offered by others, and saying like I said, not knowing what else to do other than being like, yeah, could be. That's a compelling vision of reality. It's really interesting. I don't know if it's true or not, but yeah, I mean, I'm impressed by a lot of people, so anyway, all of that has kind of led me to a more agnostic position. And then, as we'll get to eventually, there's also this, like fundamental change in my thinking about the hypothesis of indifference versus a value selection hypothesis. But all that other stuff was pretty instrumental in leading me to agnosticism.
Yeah, it seems like to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, Emerson, like it seems like you've kind of seen how like there's people like very smart, well-informed, intelligent people who are Christians, who are atheists, who are agnostics, Hindus, Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, and because of that, it kind of just leaves you like in this like agnostic stance of like, okay, like well, there's really smart people on all sides, so it's not like all the smart people are on this corner of the epistemic landscape, but everyone else is just crazy.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely part of it. Again, I'm not like adrift where it's like I feel like I know nothing. Like, no, there are plenty of things I know. Like I don't feel like untethered to reality. Like, oh, anything is just as permissible as anything else. Like, no, but um, but I don't know. I've been impressed by a lot of people with completely different views. Um, but yeah, I mean, something that hasn't changed though is like this one way of defining religious ambiguity is just that theism and atheism and like very accepting various religions, this is all like rationally permissible. Which I do think that you can be an atheist and be rational, and you can be a theist and be rational. So like I think that theism and atheism can both be rational to hold, and that's an opinion I've had for a long time. Like I've defended it in other videos. Like I have a couple of videos about epistemology on my channel. And I think I talk about this in both of the longer ones that I made somewhat recently. Um, but yeah, I just think that whether or not a belief is justified is subject dependent. Like there's no such thing as a proposition that's just by itself justified or unjustified. Like that doesn't make any sense. Um, So yeah, I get more into that in those videos I mentioned, but um, I think that you can be a theism and be, or you can be a theism. You can be a theist and be justified in your theism, and you can be an atheist and be justified in your atheism. So like that's one sense in which the world is religiously ambiguous, but that is not really. I mean, I've felt that way for a long time. Like you can be a rational theist and you can be a rational atheist. They can both be rational to hold. It just depends on your like evidence, because we don't all have the same evidence. That's how that's possible. So like, if you've had a really powerful religious experience, you have different evidence than I have. So like it makes sense for you to believe different things depending on like what life experiences you've had and what books you've read and like what evidence is available to you, you know. So it can be rational for you to be an atheist, depending on the evidence that's available to you. Your atheism can be justified. Um, and yeah, so I think I've thought the world is religiously ambiguous in that way for quite some time, and like it slowly started to feel like, okay, no one really has a decisive case, and the only way to give an impression of having a decisive case is to just put a spotlight on the evidence that supports your view, and then you just kind of like don't think about the evidence that doesn't support your view. Um, that's at least how it works for me. Like I think there's lots of evidence for atheism, but I and I can get in an atheist mindset really easily if I just focus on that evidence and I really go through, like some of Draper's arguments and like some of Schellenberg's arguments. And like I can easily get the impression like, oh yeah, theism is definitely false. But I have to like just look at the evidence against theism and, not think too much about the evidence for it. And I can similarly get in a different state of mind if I just focus on the evidence for theism. Some people, when they talk about doxastic voluntarism, this is kind of what they're getting at. They're like, you can just sort of put yourself in this epistemic, you can put like blinders on and then just focus on the evidence for theism and stuff and just kind of ignore all the evidence against it. And then you can kind of choose to eventually believe in theism because that will have an effect on you. If you only ever spotlight the evidence that supports a certain position, then yeah, the position is going to seem way more reasonable. So but I just, it was hard to maintain like a belief in atheism while also thinking that, like, oh, I only think this is so in the bag because I'm just kind of highlighting the evidence that's supporting it and not highlighting to the same extent the evidence against it.
So, talk a little bit about Emerson. You talked about like the value selection hypothesis. Talk about like what that is with regards to like the principle of indifference and whatnot, and kind of how that's played into your thinking.
Yeah, so this is kind of important to why I was an atheist. Like I accepted the hypothesis of indifference. Actually, we debated the problem of evil, I think, and I mean, like a lot of my case had to do with defending the hypothesis of indifference. And I'm like, okay, look at all this, moral randomness. Like, look at all these processes in the natural world that just clearly have, like, they don't care about good or evil. They're not malevolent, but they're not benevolent either. They're just totally indifferent to value and disvalue. They're like all these natural processes are just totally indifferent to good and evil. Um, so there's lots of evidence for the hypothesis of indifference. It does a really good job explaining, like evolutionary history, for example. Um, so if you focus on nothing but evolutionary animal suffering, you're like, wow, the case for indifference is in the bag. Um, but there's some evidence against indifference. So like, I think that, just to back up a step, I think that the hypothesis of indifference is incompatible with theism because theism says there's this um, very powerful, very good being at the foundation of reality that is like, um, you know, it's not indifferent at all. Like God cares about good and evil. Like there's supposedly some kind of moral rationale behind the suffering we see in the world if theism is true. Um, and according to the Bible, God like knows the number of hairs on your head and stuff. Like he's like he's very not indifferent to good and evil and value and disvalue and to human affairs and all that. Um, so, theism is incompatible with the hypothesis of indifference. So, if you can support the hypothesis of indifference with all this evidence of like, pointless suffering and moral randomness, okay, so to the extent that the hypothesis of indifference is established, or like there's evidence for that, then that's the extent to which you can be sure that theism is false. So I thought hypothesis of indifference is true, and that's why I think atheism is justified. Like that's the main line of justification. So the problem is that there are some things in our world that seem to not be totally blind to value and disvalue. Um, so this is kind of like, the fine tuning argument, or the psychophysical harmony argument, or the axiological arc of the universe, or even more like, I don't know if they're fringe arguments exactly, but like Thomas Nagel mentions in Mind and Cosmos, how increasingly it is looking like there's not much of a gap between the formation of the earth and the emergence of life. Like as soon as it was possible for life to emerge, it pretty much did. Okay, there wasn't like a billion years of nothing, where it was possible for life to emerge and then it just didn't, and then eventually random chance did some heavy lifting. Um, it's been a while since I've read that book, but there are just all these things that seem like very strong hints that the universe is not totally indifferent to life and value and harmonious conscious life and all that. So if you take fine tuning arguments seriously, which I have increasingly been taking them seriously, whereas before I was like very dismissive about fine tuning arguments, but a lot of that had to do with the fact that it's usually presented as an argument for theism. And I think that like fine tuning is not a great argument for theism specifically, but it is a pretty great argument for value selection. Like, so I think there are lots of phenomena. Many of them have to do with laws of nature, like really fundamental things, like physical laws and psychophysical laws, and large scale trends of the universe. Like, not so much like the specifics, so like if you think about the asteroid killing the dinosaurs, that is pretty well explained by indifference, I think, as is like you know the distribution of pain and pleasure, how it aligns with evolutionary goals. There're just all these things that align with indifference, but then there are this other category of things. Many of them have to do with like foundational reality, like laws of nature or something like that, that definitely do not seem indifferent to value and disvalue. Like, I think the psychophysical harmony argument is incredibly powerful evidence for value selection. I think fine tuning is also very good evidence for value selection. So yeah, I think there's evidence against the hypothesis of indifference, where I just don't think that every single natural process and like law of nature is just like completely blind and indifferent to good and evil and value and disvalue. Um, so sorry, I've been throwing around this term value selection. I haven't even defined it. I mean, it's probably obvious like what it means from the context, but like, it's like the opposite of the hypothesis of indifference, Um, but like when Philip Goff is talking about the hypothesis of indifference, or like a value selection effect, or the value selection hypothesis, it's usually in the context of, or it's often in the context of fine tuning, and he'll say like, okay, there are these constants that are life permitting, these like laws, parameters, constants, whatever, that are like life permitting. We have a life permitting universe, okay, and the value selection hypothesis applied here is that those like constants, laws, parameters are the way they are because they allow for life. So like the value of life, the end goal toward like that, this is aimed towards life. Like that is the reason why these constants are the way they are. Okay, like um whereas like on the hypothesis of indifference, it's just a coincidence, I guess, that we have a life permitting universe. Like it's I'm not really trying to steel man the anti fine tuning position here. I'm just trying to explain like, okay, on a value selection hypothesis, the fact that it's valuable, that it's good, that factors into the real explanation for why these laws are the way they are. And that it's like totally inconsistent with the hypothesis of indifference. So, I take value selection so like if you see something like psychophysically harmonious laws that are so vanishingly improbable, well, okay, um that is evidence, I think, that Anyway, sorry, I'm getting off track. I mentioned earlier that I'm kind of sick, so I'm easily confused right now. Um, Sorry, but yeah, I mean, I think that there are some phenomena that it makes no sense to think that this is the product of indifference. Okay, like it seems like the simplest explanation is that, we landed on this tiny slice of probability space, this thing that is very good and very improbable. Like, it just feels weird to try to explain that without any reference to the fact that it's valuable and that it's good. So, the most popular form of the value selection hypothesis is theism. It's pretty much the only one that people talk about, which is just like, I guess the simulation hypothesis is like a close second, maybe. Just the idea that, like, there's some kind of factoring in of value and disvalue into why things are the way they are, even on like a fundamental level. But there are personal and impersonal forms of the value selection hypothesis. So Philip Goff defends something called panagentialism. Thomas Nagel defends teleological laws. I mentioned the simulation hypothesis. Uh, there have been some philosophers in history like Samuel Alexander or Teilhard de Chardin who believe in like something like teleological laws, like some kind of drive towards things of value. There's some reason to think like Aristotle believed something similar, and you know there does seem to be this like push towards the good, like this non-indifference, in the universe, and it's just it's hard because there's not like a common cultural reference point where I can just be like, oh, this thing, like this non-theistic impersonal form of the value selection hypothesis, like this is not really like a common part of like, you know 20th century philosophy or 21st century philosophy. Though it's interesting that C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, which I was just looking at a few months ago, he like addresses this kind of like this like school of thought. Like he at least thought like, oh, I have to deal with like these types of non-believers as well. And it wasn't like the main focus or anything, but it's like he thought like, well, of course I have to address this, you know. Anyway, I just found that interesting because he was almost taking it as like a matter of course that like, well, you know what I'm talking about. And it's like, I don't think modern audiences would know what he was talking about. um, but anyway, I just think there are these impersonal forms of the value selection hypothesis, and there are certainly non-theistic forms of the value selection hypothesis um, that are out there. And just because you think fine tuning is like a great argument, or psychophysical harmony is a great argument, like they acknowledge this. Dustin Crummett and Brian Cutter acknowledges at the beginning of their psychophysical harmony paper that like, look, this is equally good evidence for other hypotheses, and the thing they all have in common is that they're all value selection hypotheses. So the main hangup, the reason this doesn't really get me to theism is because there's all this evidence against value selection, and it makes me. The thing is, you want like a push towards the good, but you don't want it to be so strong that you expect things to be like perfect, that you expect this to be like the best of all possible worlds, because it isn't. So the problem with theism is that it's just like, by my lights, it's just too good to be true for this world. Like, yeah, like you want to push towards the good. Like I accept the value selection hypothesis. I'm not agnostic about that. But I just don't want the value selection hypothesis to involve a push towards the good that is so strong that it contradicts, the like moral randomness of the universe, which seems kind of apparent to me. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't get me to theism, but I think that the value selection hypothesis is true. I've come to reject the hypothesis of indifference, even though, again, indifference is a great hypothesis for explaining certain things, like evolutionary animal suffering. Um, but yeah, it just seems like the evidence is pointing away from that ultimately, but not necessarily in the direction of theism. And because we set up this kind of false dichotomy between like total indifference or this like radical form of the value selection hypothesis, where not only is there this push towards the good, but it's like a conscious, rational being who is perfectly good and can do anything. Okay, well, like I don't think that that's consistent with the universe that I live in. Um, there's some like fantastic stories that theists have proposed to like try to, accommodate the the evil and suffering in the world, but ultimately it feels like you're just twisting yourself into pretzels to avoid the fact that like this is not the best of all possible worlds. But I guess I am more open to like finitist forms of theism than the kind of, maximalist, unlimited forms of theism where God can like do anything.
Yeah, it's interesting, and thank you for sharing all that, Emerson. There is this, like, to me, like, this, I don't know if the word's contrast, but like we see, like, I just seen, like, in my life, like, there's a lot of good things that we can experience, like, or just see, like, that seem to, like, be designed towards, like, value, like, in, like, relationships or nature, things like that. And there's also, like, the suffering that we see. Like roadkill, for example. You can drive on a road and you can see a beautiful view as you're going through, like, I live in Virginia, the Blue Ridge Mountains, and you can look and you can see a squirrel that just got ran over. And you can wonder,
Mhm.
okay, well, is there value here? Is there suffering? And I even saw this like recently, like with my grandmother passing away. Like there is this like contrast of like there's suffering, but then there's also value and like beauty of like life and relationships. And I don't know. Like for me, reflecting on that, like it drove me like closer or like maybe like stronger in my like theistic belief because I of my belief in like triumph and whatnot. But all that to say that like it just seems like to me like we can walk around and like we can see this reality that where we can see things of like value, but we can also see things that seem to be or like suffering that appears to be like indifferent. So yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I that's why I brought up the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs because it's like there's just this rock hurtling towards Earth, and that just seems like a especially if I were a dinosaur, I would be like, the universe is indifferent. There's just this rock floating through space, and then it like hits Earth and like causes all this death and suffering. And then on the other hand, there are these laws of nature. We live in this life permitting universe, and things did not have to be this way. Like we did not have to live in a universe where life exists, let alone where complex conscious life exists. And even if there were complex conscious life, it might not be harmonious. Like it might just be like some like William James used the phrase buzzing, blooming confusion to talk about like a baby's consciousness. And I mean, like there's really no reason it couldn't have just been like that, even granting life and complex life and consciousness. Like we could have disharmonious conscious lives, and it wouldn't affect natural selection. So, you know, it just seems like, given the fine tuning of physical laws and fine tuning of psychophysical laws, it ultimately strains credulity for me to think that like the universe is just totally and utterly indifferent to value and disvalue, and like the fact that basically as soon as it was possible for life to emerge, it did. Um, you know, that is a little more contentious, but there's an interesting case to be made there. Yeah, there are all these like hints that the universe is not just totally blind and indifferent to life and consciousness and value and disvalue, but and yet, like you said, the dead animals on the side of the road, um, and evolutionary history, and yeah, it's just there are so many things that I mean, it just feels like the evidence is pointing in every direction at once. Like that's how it feels to me. Um, but to say the universe is totally and utterly indifferent in every respect to value and disvalue, I'm fairly confident that's false. And then when it comes to like the maximalist forms of theism, where they're like, there's this uh, maximally good being, like this perfect being that's unlimited in power, can do anything, he's perfectly good, and he's sovereign over reality itself. It's like, huh, I haven't noticed that. Um, but that doesn't mean theism can't be true, by the way. Even like general skepticism about like maximalist forms of theism, there still might be a maximalist form of theism that survives the like various critiques based on evil. But uh, one thing that hasn't changed is I think arguments from evil are like incredibly successful arguments. They are like the way that they're diminished by a lot of theists is like kind of frustrating because they're like uniquely powerful arguments. It's like most arguments in philosophy are not this good. like um and they're just so frequently misunderstood by theists, online. Um yeah, I wish that theists would put a little bit more thought into the arguments from evil that have been presented because it's just more common to encounter people who just go off of like memes and stuff than they just don't like just read like Paul Draper's stuff about evil, like just give it a read and like see if it matches what you thought you were going to read because I bet it doesn't. I bet it will not match your expectations. But yeah, I think arguments from evil are like very powerful, but like I said, there are just so many possible worlds where there's some kind of divine reality. Even if you want to say that arguments from evil are like totally successful refutations of certain forms of theism, that's still all you can say. It's just, they refute certain forms of theism, but not this like non-specific idea that maybe there's a God, or like some divine reality or something.
Yeah, thanks for that, Emerson. We're kind of coming close to like the end of our time here. Is there any like last thoughts or like things you want to say here that we didn't cover? We had a lot more covered in like our doc, but obviously we aren't going to get through all of it. Anything else you want to say about like where you're at in your journey in agnosticism or different points or whatnot?
Not really at this time. Like I've been taking a break from a lot of this stuff. Been kind of busy with work, and like I mentioned before, my wife is pregnant, and we're moving across the country. Like, there's just a lot going on. So I've been trying to like take a break from like philosophy of religion and stuff, and it's impossible not to think about it. But I've still been like trying to take a break because I was slightly burnt out. So I like released a video where I was kind of like, am I agnostic? I don't know, maybe. Like I didn't have like a big announcement like I am no longer an atheist. Please buy my book, Atheism Debunked or whatever. Like I didn't really do that. I didn't really even say I'm definitely not an atheist. Like, because when I made that video about agnosticism, I was like, it was a genuine question. I'm like, am I agnostic? Like, I don't know, maybe. So yeah, yeah, I've been taking a break, which has been nice, and like to the extent I have been reading, it's not really been about philosophy of religion. Um, I just finished this book called Chaos by Tom O'Neill about the Manson murders and like how the official story about that is it turns out to be like provably wrong. So I mean that was interesting. Um, but yeah, I've been enjoying taking like at least a moderate break from like philosophy of religion stuff. But yeah, thanks for having me on, man. It's really good to talk to you again.
I really feel like I need to like clickbait this title and now be like Emerson Green like returns from the dark, Christian question mark, atheist question mark, agnostic question mark. What is he now? Click to find out. Maybe I should find some like random
Yeah.
clickbait
And then it's
title.
just music and it's like patreon.com/adherent apologetics.
Perfect. You just did it. It's perfect. I don't even need to use this whole recording we just did. We'll just use that little part. Yeah, it's been so great to talk with you, Emerson. I just appreciate how you approach these things, and I love talking with you, and I hope to do it again. And yeah, thank you, Emerson, for coming on. How can people like follow you, connect with you, things like that?
Yeah, just go to Emerson Green, the YouTube channel, Emerson Green. If you would rather listen on podcasts, I've got two podcasts. One of them is called Walden Pod, and one of them is called Counter Apologetics. Um, but yeah, that's where you can find me. You can also find me on Twitter, where I spend way too much time at Walden Pod. But yeah, that's where they can find me.
Well, Emerson, one last time, again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. So excited for you and everything that's coming. And I hope that you don't get too busy, that you don't get to come back on Adherent Apologetics again, because I love talking with you. And I'm sure hopefully we'll do it again. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you like Adherent Apologetics, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, all that fun stuff. And as Emerson said, go to patreon.com/Adherent Apologetics and you can support the show if you want to. But Emerson, one last time, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope you have a good one, and God bless. We'll catch you next time.